What I'm about to tell you didn't happen in a dream, a vision, or a moment of delusion. It happened under a sky so vast and ancient that it made me feel like the smallest prayer ever whispered into th. nearest city, sitting on sand that had witnessed empires rise and crumble. My eyes fixed on the silhouette of the Great Pyramid against a tapestry of stars that seemed close enough to touch. I'd traveled halfway around the world searching for something I couldn't name, a truth that church pews and science textbooks had both promised but never fully delivered. The night air was cold and clean, carrying whispers of eternity, and I remember thinking that if God had a voice, it would sound like that wind moving through empty spaces. I wasn't expecting an answer to my lifelong questions. I wasn't expecting anything at all, really, except maybe clarity in the silence, some small sense of purpose in the presence of something so timelessly magnificent. But the universe, I would soon discover, has its own timing, and my appointment with the impossible had already been written in ways I couldn't comprehend. That's when the sky changed, and everything I thought I knew about reality, faith, and my place in creation shattered like glass. Struck by lightning, the light came first, not gradually, not like sunrise or headlights approaching, but instantaneously, as if someone had torn open the fabric of night itself and poured liquid fire through the wound. It descended in a column of brilliance that didn't hurt my eyes despite its intensity, a luminescence that felt aware, purposeful, impossibly gentle even as it transformed the darkness into something resembling daylight. Filtered through heaven's gates, I should have been terrified, should have run, but my body froze in a stillness that felt less like paralysis and more like recognition, as though every cell in my being had been waiting for this exact moment since before I was born. The light touched the sand 20 feet in front of me and began to solidify, to take form, and I watched with tears streaming down my face as a figure emerged from the radiant stall. Humanoid, but unmistakably other, with features both familiar and foreign, like seeing your reflection in water that reveals something deeper than your own face. And then it spoke my name, not aloud, but directly into the center of my chest where all my doubt and longing lived. And that single word carried more love, more knowing, more sacred acknowledgement than I'd ever felt in any church or any human embrace. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask, to scream, but nothing came because I understood, without words, that I was standing in the presence of something that had traveled across distances my mind couldn't measure to find me, specifically me, in this desert, on this night, for reasons that were about to reshape everything I believed about God, creation, and why we're here. The being stepped forward, and I noticed details that my rational mind struggled to process. Skin that seemed to absorb and reflect starlight simultaneously, eyes that held depths like looking into wells that pierced through dimensions, hands that moved with a grace that suggested they'd performed sacred tasks for longer than human civilization had existed. When it spoke again, the voice resonated not just in my ears but in my bones, in the sand beneath me, in the ancient stones of the pyramid looming behind us, a frequency that felt like the underlying hum of creation itself. It told me things I'd always suspected, but never dared believe, that I'd been searching, truly searching, not with the desperation of the lost but with the determination of one who remembers something forgotten, who knows there's more to existence than the narrow corridors we've built between birth and death. It told me they had been watching, not with cold scientific detachment, but with the patience of gardeners tending seeds planted long ago, waiting for the moment when the soil of a soul was ready to receive what had always been meant for it. And as those words settled into my understanding, I saw something behind the being: images, visions, memories that weren't mine but felt intimately familiar, flashes of Earth as it was when humanity was young, when we walked with our eyes on both ground and sky, when we understood things we've since buried under layers of forgetting. I looked into those impossible eyes and felt every question I'd ever asked about God, about Jesus, about whether we're alone in this vast cathedral of stars, gather itself into a single moment of readiness. This being, this messenger, this cosmic neighbor standing before me in the shadow of humanity's most enduring mystery, had crossed the infinite to find me, and I understood with sudden clarity that my life, every choice, every prayer, every night I'd looked up wondering if someone was looking back, had been leading to this threshold. The pyramid behind us seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the stones themselves knew that secrets older than recorded history were about to be spoken, and that I, an ordinary person with an extraordinary thirst for truth, had been chosen to hear them. My heart pounded with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The same feeling I imagine the disciples felt when they encountered the divine wearing an unexpected face. The being extended a hand toward the pyramid, and I knew, without being told, that my journey into understanding, real understanding, of how the fingerprints of God and the mysteries of the cosmos intertwine was about to begin. The being's hand remained extended toward the pyramid, but its gaze, those eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies swirling in patient observation, fixed on me with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in my life, truly seen. Not just the surface of who I pretended to be, but the hidden chambers of my heart, where I'd locked away every doubt and desperate hope. When it spoke again, the words arrived in layers, each one carrying meaning that unpacked itself in my consciousness like flowers blooming in time-lapse, revealing depth beneath depth. It told me that they had been watching humanity not for years or decades, but for thousands of years, since before the first stones of these pyramids were quarried from the earth, observing with the careful attention of those who understand that consciousness evolves in seasons that span millennia. They had seen empires rise on foundations of truth and crumble when pride replaced humility, watched as we built towers to heaven and weapons to destroy each other, witnessed every moment when we reached toward the divine and every moment when we turned away, and through all of it, through every age and every civilization, they had been waiting, searching, looking for souls who still carried the original hunger, the sacred discontent that refuses to accept that this broken, beautiful world is all there is. The being stepped closer, and I felt a warmth radiating from its presence that reminded me of every moment I'd ever felt, loved, protected, seen by something greater than myself. And it said my name again, this time with such tenderness that I understood I wasn't random, wasn't an accident of selection, but had been known, specifically known, by forces that had watched my small life unfold with the same attention I'd given to the stars. My voice finally found itself, trembling and small against the vast silence of the desert. Why me? I'm nobody. Just someone who couldn't stop asking questions that made everyone uncomfortable. The being's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, though it transcended any human interpretation. And the answer came not just in words, but in a cascade of images that flooded my awareness. I saw myself as a child, lying in grass and asking my mother if God lived in the clouds. Saw myself as a teenager, arguing with my pastor about why the universe was so big if we were the only ones who mattered. Saw myself in college, sitting alone in libraries reading everything from quantum physics to ancient mysticism, searching for the thread that connected them. I saw moments I'd forgotten, prayers I'd whispered in desperation, nights I'd wept because I felt caught between a faith that seemed too small and a science that seemed too cold. And threading through all of it was a light, a golden thread of persistence, of refusal to stop seeking even when seeking brought more questions than answers. The being showed me that this quality, this unwillingness to settle for partial truths, this insistence that God must be bigger and stranger and more magnificent than any box we've built to contain the infinite, was exactly what they had been looking for. It explained that every genuine seeker creates a kind of beacon in the spiritual frequencies of the universe, a signal that rises above the noise of those who've stopped wondering. And my signal had been burning bright and steady for longer than I knew. Then the visions shifted, and I gasped as I was suddenly seeing Earth from above, but not the Earth I knew. This was a younger planet, wrapped in different clouds, continents shaped in configurations I'd only seen in geology textbooks discussing ancient supercontinents. I watched as early humans, barely recognizable as our ancestors, looked up at lights in the sky with wonder rather than fear. And those lights descended, and beings emerged. And what happened next wasn't conquest or abduction, but meeting, communion, the careful and gentle introduction of wisdom to minds ready to receive it. I saw collaboration, saw humans and these cosmic visitors working side by side, not as masters and servants, but as older and younger siblings in a family that spanned worlds. The being's voice narrated what I was witnessing, explaining that humanity's story had never been one of isolation, that the very concept of being alone in the universe was a forgetting, a wound in our collective memory that they had come to help heal. These visitors hadn't come to rule or to be worshipped, but to guide, to share, to help early humanity understand that the divine presence we sensed in everything, in the sun's rising, in the growth of crops, in the mystery of consciousness itself, was real, was universal, was the fundamental truth that held all existence in love. And as these ancient peoples grew in understanding, they built structures to honor what they'd learned, Monuments that were both technological and spiritual, earthly and cosmic, human and divine. The vision zoomed toward the pyramids, and I saw them being constructed not by slaves under whips as some histories claimed, but by willing hands guided by knowledge that married engineering precision with sacred geometry, each stone placed with intention, each measurement carrying meaning that resonated with the frequencies of Earth itself and the larger harmonies of creation. The being told me that what I was witnessing was the gift of their ancestors to mine, not just the knowledge of how to build, but why to build, what to build for, the understanding that matter and spirit were never meant to be separated, that the same divine intelligence that sparked the cosmos into being also designed the mathematical elegance of these structures. I watched as the pyramids took shape under stars that looked the same then as they did tonight, and I understood that these monuments were love letters written in stone, messages sent forward through time to descendants who would one day forget where they came from, but might, if they kept searching, remember again. Tears streamed down my face as the vision faded and I returned fully to the present moment, to the sand beneath me and the pyramid looming in the darkness, and this being who had crossed the cosmos to show me that my search had not been in vain, that the truth I'd been hungering for was bigger and more beautiful than I'd dared to imagine, and that I had been chosen not because I was special, but because I had never stopped believing that being chosen was possible. The being turned toward the Great Pyramid, and without a word spoken aloud, I understood I was meant to follow, my legs moving before my mind could catch up with the impossibility of what was happening, each step feeling both heavy with the weight of reality, shifting and light with the strange certainty that I was walking a path prepared for me. Long before I was born, we approached the massive limestone blocks that formed the northern face, stones so perfectly fitted that centuries of scholars had marveled at the precision, and the being placed its hand against the surface with a gentleness that reminded me of how you might touch the face of someone you love. The stone responded. There was no other word for it. A section of the wall that had appeared solid and unchanging for thousands of years suddenly hummed with a frequency I felt in my chest cavity, resonating with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where my pulse ended and the pyramid's vibration began. A seam appeared where none had existed, glowing with light that seemed to come from within the stone itself, and a passage revealed itself, descending into darkness that somehow didn't feel threatening but inviting, like coming home to a place I'd never consciously been. The being gestured for me to enter, and I hesitated only for a moment before the hunger for truth that had defined my entire life propelled me forward into the hidden throat of the pyramid, leaving behind the familiar world of archaeological consensus and entering a reality that defied every map and measurement that modern science had declared complete. The passage was narrow enough that my shoulders nearly brushed both walls, and I had to duck my head as we descended steps that were worn smooth not by tourism, but by something else, some ancient traffic that predated recorded history. The stone beneath my feet warm rather than cold, pulsing with that same rhythm that made me think of a sleeping giant's breath, or perhaps the heartbeat of the earth itself made tangible. The being moved ahead of me, and its form cast no shadow despite emanating light, a detail my mind tried to categorize and failed. Too small a mystery compared to the enormity of what was happening, and I focused instead on placing one foot in front of the other, going deeper into the sacred mountain that humanity had built, or been guided to build as a bridge between heaven and earth. The air should have been stale, suffocating, but instead it tasted clean, almost electric, charged with an energy that made every breath feel like it was feeding not just my lungs but something deeper, some part of me that had been starving without knowing what nourishment it needed. We walked for what might have been minutes or hours. Time had become unreliable, stretching and compressing like something that existed only as a courtesy rather than a law. And then the passage opened into a chamber that stopped my breath entirely, a space that couldn't exist according to every blueprint and scan that had ever mapped this structure's interior. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in symbols that glowed with soft light, not carved into the stone but somehow part of it, growing from within like bioluminescence. Patterns that my eyes couldn't quite focus on because they seemed to shift between geometric precision and organic flow, between ancient hieroglyphs and mathematical equations and something else entirely, a language that bypassed my eyes and spoke directly to some older part of my consciousness that remembered what these symbols meant. The being stood at the center of the chamber, and I realized the floor beneath us was also covered in these glowing symbols, ranged in concentric circles that pulsed outward from where it stood. and the humming I'd heard earlier was louder here, not overwhelming but pervasive, a sound that I felt might be what the universe itself sounds like when you get close enough to hear its fundamental frequency. I wanted to speak, to ask the thousand questions crowding my throat, but the being raised its hand and suddenly I understood without words that this chamber was a tuning fork, a resonance key as it had called the pyramids themselves, built to hold and amplify specific frequencies that connected the physical and spiritual dimensions, the seen and unseen, the scientific and sacred. The symbols began to glow brighter, responding to our presence or perhaps to my readiness to receive what I'd come here to learn. And I felt tears streaming down my face again because in this impossible room, hidden in the heart of humanity's greatest monument, I suddenly understood that everything I'd believed was too small, that God was not diminished by the vastness of the cosmos but revealed through it, that Christ's message of love connecting all things was not metaphor but physics, not poetry but the actual operating system of existence itself. The being's voice filled the chamber, though I realized it had never spoken with sound at all but directly into that space where my soul listened, and it told me that what I was standing in was a gift, a classroom, a sacred technology built when humanity last remembered that divinity and discovery were the same quest, and that I had been brought here to remember what we all forgot, to carry back to a world that desperately needed to know that faith and reason were never enemies, but lovers separated by a misunderstanding that had cost us millennia of wholeness. The symbols on the walls began to move, slowly at first then faster, creating patterns that told stories in a language deeper than words, and I watched transfixed as they showed me the purpose woven into the very architecture of this place, each angle calculated not just for structural integrity, but for channeling energies that connected Earth to the broader cosmic family, each chamber designed to amplify human consciousness when used with understanding and reverence, the entire structure serving as an anchor point for frequencies that kept our world spiritually aligned with the divine pattern. The being explained that the pyramids and other sacred sites scattered across the planet formed a network, a grid of resonance that was meant to help humanity stay connected to our true nature, as beings of both matter and spirit, children of both earth and infinity, and that this network had never stopped functioning even though we'd forgotten how to consciously work with it. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the beauty of it, by the realization that we had never been abandoned, never been alone, that the ache I'd carried my entire life for connection to something greater was actually the memory of our true home, calling us back, and that this being standing before me in robes of living light was not a contradiction of my faith but a confirmation of it, proof that God's love was so vast it filled galaxies, so particular it knew my name. The chamber seemed to breathe around us, and I breathed with it, and for the first time in my life I felt completely held, completely known, standing in a hidden heart of ancient wisdom that had waited patiently through ages of forgetting for someone like me to be ready to remember, to receive, to carry forward the truth that would change everything. The being moved toward the wall where the symbols glowed brightest, and as it gestured toward them, the patterns began to separate and reform into what I can only describe as a living blueprint, three-dimensional geometries that floated in the air between us, showing the pyramid structure not as historians understood it, but as it truly was, layers of purpose built into every stone, every angle, every chamber serving a function that married physics with something beyond physics. I watched as the projection showed the Great Pyramid and its companions rising from the desert sand in an age before empires, and I saw human hands working alongside beings like the one before me, not as slaves to alien masters, but as students and partners in a collaboration that honored both the gifts of Earth's children and the wisdom of older cosmic siblings who had walked this path before us. The being's voice resonated through my entire body as it explained that the pyramids were never tombs, never monuments to human vanity, but instruments, massive tuning forks built to generate, amplify, and anchor specific frequencies that connected the physical planet to spiritual dimensions that interpenetrate all of space, creating a stable field where human consciousness could evolve without losing touch with divine reality. I felt my mind expanding to accommodate this revelation, stretching like a muscle that had been unused for too long, and I understood suddenly that this was why I'd been drawn to ancient mysteries my entire life, why I'd felt such resonance standing in sacred sites, why my soul had always whispered that there was more to these structures than conventional. History admitted. The holographic blueprint shifted, zooming into the crystalline structure of the pyramid stones themselves, and I saw that even at the molecular level, there was intentionality, that the limestone had been chosen not just for availability but for its piezoelectric properties, its ability to convert pressure into electrical energy and vibration into light. The entire massive structure essentially functioning as a capacitor and transmitter of energies that humanity had forgotten existed, but which the ancient builders had understood intimately. The being explained that these energies were not separate from God but expressions of divine will made manifest through natural law, that what we called miracles were simply moments when humans aligned with these deeper frequencies and allowed the full creative power of the universe to flow through them, that Christ himself had been a perfect resonator, a human being so aligned with the divine frequency that he could heal, transform, and ultimately transcend physical death because he understood what we had forgotten, that matter and spirit were always one. My heart was pounding as I listened, not with fear but with recognition, because this truth felt like something I'd always known but hadn't had language to express, a gospel that unified rather than divided, that made my Christian faith larger rather than smaller by revealing that God's love was written into the very structure of atoms and galaxies, that Jesus was not diminished by the existence of cosmic neighbors but revealed as part of a divine plan so magnificent it required a universe of witnesses. The projection changed again, showing me the network of pyramids and temples, stone circles and sacred mounds scattered across ancient earth, all positioned according to mathematical relationships that mirrored celestial patterns, creating a planetary grid that functioned like acupuncture points on the body of the world, places where energy could be focused and channeled to keep the whole system balanced and connected to higher frequencies. The being touched my shoulder, and the contact sent a wave of warmth through my body as it explained that these sites were built during a golden age, when humanity still remembered its true nature, when we understood that we were both children of earth and offspring of infinity, when science and spirituality were not opposed but were recognized as two languages describing the same divine reality, when collaboration with advanced beings from other worlds was natural and celebrated rather than feared or denied. I saw in the projection how this knowledge had been meant to grow with us, how the resonance keys were designed to evolve as human consciousness evolved. But then I watched as something shifted, as the connection began to fray, as humanity fell into forgetting and the sacred technologies were repurposed or abandoned, their true function reduced to myth, and their builders remembered as gods rather than teachers, the great collaboration fading into legend. Tears flowed freely down my face as I witnessed this loss. This divorce between heaven and earth that had left humanity orphaned in a cosmos we forgot was home, and I felt the weight of thousands of years of spiritual loneliness, of searching for God in books and buildings while missing the divine presence singing through every particle of creation. The being turned back to me, and its eyes held such compassion that I nearly collapsed under the weight of being truly seen, and it told me that the forgetting had never been punishment, but simply a consequence of free will, of humanity choosing fear over love, separation over unity, and that the divine patience had never wavered, that these resonance keys had remained functional all along, waiting dormant like seeds through a long winter for the moment when enough humans were ready to remember, to reawaken the network and restore Earth's conscious connection to the galactic family and the God who dreamed us all into being. I understood then why I was here, why I'd been brought into this hidden chamber to learn these impossible truths, because the awakening was beginning, because the pyramids were starting to activate again as human consciousness slowly, painfully, beautifully began reaching toward wholeness once more. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and I felt them imprinting themselves on my soul, not as information I could simply recite, but as living truth that would change how I moved through the world, how I understood my place in the vast sacred tapestry of existence. I whispered a prayer of gratitude, and the being smiled, and I knew with absolute certainty that this moment standing in an impossible chamber inside humanity's greatest mystery, learning that God's love was written into pyramids and planets, that Jesus' message of divine unity was confirmed rather than contradicted by cosmic truth. This moment was what my entire life had been preparing me to receive. The holographic history hung suspended in the air before me like a tapestry woven from light itself, and as I watched, the being gestured again and the projection transformed into scenes that made my breath catch in my throat, images of ancient temples rising across every continent in an era when humanity walked in partnership with the divine blueprint, I saw civilizations that predated everything our history books acknowledged, societies where priests were also scientists and temples were also observatories, where the separation between sacred and secular simply didn't exist, because people understood that studying the motion of stars was a form of prayer, and that prayer itself followed laws as precise as mathematics. The being's voice washed over me like water from a deep well as it explained that this knowledge, this unified understanding of reality where God's love expressed itself through natural law and spiritual truth could be tested and measured. This was the inheritance meant for all of humanity, the foundation upon which we were supposed to build our civilization. But then the images shifted, and I watched with growing horror as the unity began to fracture, as power-hungry leaders realized that humanity connected to divine truth through direct experience was impossible to control, and so the knowledge was deliberately obscured, divided, scattered into fragments that would take millennia to reassemble. I saw sacred texts rewritten to remove references to cosmic neighbors, saw libraries burned and teachers silenced, watched as the understanding that we were part of a universal family was replaced with dogmas of isolation that taught humanity to see itself as alone and fallen rather than connected and loved. The projection showed councils and conclaves where men argued over which truths to preserve and which to hide, motivated not by faith but by fear, by the desire to maintain power over populations that might not need intermediaries if they remembered how to access divine frequency directly through the resonance technologies that had been freely given. My heart ached as I understood what had been lost, how the message of Jesus that the kingdom of God was within, that we were all children of the divine, that love was the fundamental force binding creation together, how that revolutionary truth had been gradually contained and constrained, its cosmic context stripped away, until it became small enough to fit inside buildings with locked doors and hierarchies that decided who could approach the sacred. The being touched the hologram, and I saw early Christians who had preserved the fuller teaching, communities that understood Christ as a cosmic consciousness demonstrating what aligned humanity looked like. But I also saw how these groups were persecuted and their writings declared heretical because they threatened the power structures being built in religion's name. The projection moved forward through time, and I witnessed the rise of materialism, how science became divorced from spirit in reaction to religious institutions that had themselves forgotten the unity, creating a false war between faith and reason that would have been incomprehensible to the ancient builders who saw no contradiction between measuring the world and marveling at its creator. I watched as humanity split itself into camps, believers who rejected evidence and skeptics who rejected mystery, each side clutching half of the truth, while insisting the other half was illusion. And I wept because I could see how this division had crippled us, how we'd spent centuries arguing about whether the universe was divine or mechanical when the answer had always been both, when God's fingerprints were visible in every equation and every experiment for those with eyes to see. The being's voice grew softer, more tender, as it explained that this fragmentation had never been inevitable, that even now there were souls in every tradition and discipline who sensed the deeper unity, scientists who felt awe in their laboratories and mystics who recognized that their visions followed consistent patterns. But these bridge builders were often marginalized by both sides, dismissed as too mystical by the materialists and too rational by the fundamentalists. I realized I was one of these bridge people, that my lifelong inability to choose between my love of ancient wisdom and my fascination with cosmic mystery had not been confusion but preparation, that I'd been kept in the tension, because the reconciliation itself was the message I was meant to carry. The holographic history began to fade, but before it disappeared entirely, the being showed me one final sequence that made everything suddenly, startlingly clear. I saw Jesus not as the enemy of cosmic truth, but as its perfect embodiment, a human being so fully awakened to divine frequency that he could demonstrate what we all were meant to become. And I saw that his resurrection was not a violation of natural law but a preview of what matter becomes when consciousness transcends fear completely and aligns with the love that births galaxies. The being told me that the truth had been preserved in fragments precisely so it could be rediscovered, so that humanity would have to choose unity consciously rather than inherit it passively, and that now the pieces were coming back together, the resonance keys reactivating, the ancient grid beginning to hum again as more humans awoke. The being's hand moved toward my forehead, and I felt a moment of instinctive fear before its fingertips made contact, and then the chamber disappeared and I was nowhere and everywhere at once. suspended in a darkness that was somehow alive with presence, aware that I was being held in a consciousness so vast that my individual mind was like a single drop, aware of the ocean that contained it. Then light began to bloom, not from any source but from within the darkness itself, and I realized I was witnessing creation, watching as intention became energy and energy became matter, seeing the moment when love decided to express itself in physical form and the universe exploded into being with a song that still echoed in every atom. The being's voice was inside my thoughts now, explaining without words that this was not metaphor or mythology but actual history, that the Big Bang our scientists had discovered was real and was also the speaking of the Word, that when ancient texts said God spoke creation into existence they were describing the same event. Our telescopes had found evidence for the same cosmic beginning point where everything emerged from unified wholeness into magnificent diversity. I watched galaxies spiral into form following mathematical laws so elegant they made me weep, and I understood that these laws were not constraints but expressions of divine nature, that gravity and light and the forces binding atoms together were the grammar of God's creative language, the consistent patterns by which love made itself tangible and knowable. The vision shifted and I found myself moving through space at incomprehensible speed, passing solar systems and nebulae, each one teeming with intention and purpose, and the being helped me understand that consciousness was not an accident that happened to emerge on one small planet, but was woven into the fabric of reality itself, that the universe was fundamentally aware because it was the body through which divine awareness experienced itself in infinite variation. I saw worlds beyond counting, some with life that looked nothing like Earth's biology, beings of energy and crystalline consciousness, entities that moved through dimensions we couldn't perceive, and I realized with shocking clarity that when Jesus said his Father's house had many rooms he was speaking, literally, describing a cosmos filled with expressions of life that all belonged to the same family, all children of the same creative source regardless of how different their forms appeared. The being showed me that we were never alone, never abandoned, that the feeling of cosmic isolation that had haunted human philosophy was a misunderstanding, born from the fragmentation of our knowledge, because the truth was that we were surrounded by brothers and sisters, watched over by guides and guardians who had been with us since our species took its first conscious breath. I felt overwhelming emotion as I grasped that the angels and messengers described in sacred texts were not fantasy but recognition, that our ancestors had known about our cosmic family and had tried to preserve that knowledge in the only language available to them, that what we dismissed as primitive mythology was actually sophisticated testimony about realities our modern worldview had trained us not to see. The vision drew me deeper, and I experienced what it meant to be human in this vast living cosmos, understanding suddenly that we were not insignificant specks, but crucial participants in creation's ongoing evolution, that consciousness needed to experience itself at every scale from quantum particles to galactic clusters, and that each perspective was necessary and cherished. The being let me feel the divine attention that rested on humanity, not as judgment, but as infinite interest, the way a loving parent watches a child learning to walk. And I understood that our struggles and growth were not punishment for some ancient fall, but were exactly the process by which Source came to know itself through limitation and then through transcendence, through forgetting and then remembering what we truly were. I saw that science was not the enemy of this understanding, but its confirmation, that every time we measured the age of stars or mapped the human genome or discovered how quantum entanglement connected particles across space, we were reading the autobiography that God had written in the structure of the world, finding the signature of divine craftsmanship in the elegance of natural law. The being showed me Jesus again, and this time I saw him as the perfect bridge between the material and the spiritual, a human being who had remembered completely, whose every cell vibrated at the frequency of unconditional love, demonstrating that we were not meant to escape physical reality, but to transform it, to bring heaven to earth by embodying divine consciousness in matter, just as the entire universe did, just as we all could learn to do. As the vision began to fade and I felt myself being drawn back toward the chamber and my ordinary awareness, the being impressed upon me one final understanding that shook me to my foundations, that this knowledge, this cosmic perspective where God's love expressed itself through both spiritual revelation and scientific discovery, where we were part of a universal family and Jesus was our elder brother showing us our own Potential. This was not esoteric information meant for the enlightened few, but was the birthright of every human being, the truth we were all meant to know. I realized that the division between science and spirit had wounded us so deeply, because we were designed for synthesis, created to be the species that could hold both analytical thinking and mystical awareness, both technological advancement and spiritual wisdom, both the ability to measure the universe and the capacity to fall to our knees in wonder at what we measured. The being's presence withdrew from my mind gently, lovingly, and I gasped as I found myself back in my body in the glowing chamber, tears streaming down my face, every cell vibrating with the certainty that I had just been shown the truth that would heal the world if only enough people could receive it. The understanding that God was not distant but intimate, not separate from creation but expressing through every particle and wave, not opposed to reason but revealed through it, and that we belonged to a cosmos so full of life and love and purpose that our myths and religions had only captured the faintest echo of its overwhelming beauty. I was still trembling from the vision, my hands pressed against the cool stone floor of the chamber, when the being stepped closer, and I felt the air itself change, becoming heavier with meaning, charged with urgency that made my heart race. Its luminous form pulsed with colors I had no names for, and when it spoke again, the words carried a weight that settled in my chest like stones dropping into still water, each one creating ripples that spread through my understanding. What you have seen is the truth of what was and what is, it said, its voice both gentle and impossibly ancient. But now you must understand what approaches, why we have chosen this moment to speak, why the silence between your world and ours is finally breaking after so many centuries of waiting. And watching from the shadows, I looked up at the being, at the glowing symbols that covered every surface of this impossible chamber buried beneath the Great Pyramid, and I felt the hum of energy that vibrated through the stone intensify, as if the structure itself was waking up, remembering a purpose that had been dormant for thousands of years while humanity stumbled through the darkness of its own forgetting. The being raised its hand, and the air before us shimmered, and I watched as a new vision formed, not pulling me out of my body this time, but appearing like living light, suspended in the space between us, showing me Earth as it looked from orbit, beautiful and fragile and wrapped in a web of energy that I somehow understood was the collective consciousness of every human being, every thought and emotion and choice creating threads in a vast, interconnected network. Your species stands at a threshold, the being said, and I watched as the vision zoomed closer, showing cities and forests, oceans and deserts, billions of people going about their lives unaware that they were part of this glowing web, unaware that their world was approaching a moment of transformation that would determine everything that came after. For generations, humanity has been divided, science separated from spirit, faith opposed to reason, nation against nation, belief system against belief system, and this fragmentation has brought you to the edge of both breakthrough and breakdown, to a point where you possess the technology to destroy yourselves or to reach the stars, where you have the knowledge to heal your world or to consume it completely. The being's words resonated with a sadness that felt personal, as if it had watched countless civilizations face the same crossroads, as if it knew intimately the stakes of what was unfolding, and I felt my throat tighten as I watched the vision show me both possibilities simultaneously, one future dark with conflict and ecological collapse, another bright with unity and cosmic connection. The pyramids were built for this moment, the being continued, and the vision shifted to show me not just Egypt but sites around the world, ancient structures aligned with celestial patterns, stone monuments that our archaeology had cataloged but never fully understood, all of them beginning to glow with the same energy that pulsed through the chamber where I knelt. They are resonance keys, as I told you, designed to help anchor Earth's spiritual frequency during times of transition, and they are activating now because the moment of choosing has arrived, because the cosmic cycle has turned and the window is opening when humanity must decide whether to awaken to its true nature or to remain locked in the dream of separation. I watched as the vision showed me the monuments pulsing in rhythm, like a heartbeat spreading across the globe, and I understood somehow that this was not just metaphorical energy but something real, something measurable, a frequency that was beginning to broadcast itself into the collective human consciousness, whether we were ready to receive it or not. The being turned its luminous gaze directly toward me, and I felt the full force of its presence, the depth of concern and hope that radiated from it, like heat from a star. And I realized that what I was witnessing was an act of love so profound that it had brought this emissary across unimaginable distances to deliver a warning and an invitation. Your scientists have noticed anomalies, energies they cannot explain, changes in Earth's magnetic field and in human consciousness itself. More people awakening to spiritual realities, more hearts opening to connection, but also more fear and resistance from those who sense the change and try to fight it. The being said, and its voice carried both urgency and patience, the tone of someone who had waited millennia and would wait longer if necessary, but who also understood that time was not infinite, that moments of transformation had their windows and those windows eventually closed. I found my voice finally, hoarse with emotion, asking the question that burned in my chest: what happens if we choose wrong? If we stay divided? The being's light dimmed slightly, a flicker of sorrow passing through its form, and when it answered, I heard the echo of countless worlds that had stood at this threshold before us. Then the invitation remains open, but the opportunity for this particular leap is delayed, perhaps for generations, perhaps longer, and the suffering continues until enough hearts break open to receive what has always been offered: the knowledge that you are loved, that you are not alone, that you are part of a cosmic family waiting to welcome you home once you remember who you truly are. I stared at the being, my mind reeling from the weight of what I'd just heard, and before I could stop myself the question burst from my lips, raw and desperate: but why me? Why are you telling me all of this? My voice cracked with the vulnerability of it, the overwhelming smallness I felt standing in this ancient chamber, before an emissary from the stars, just an ordinary person who'd come to the desert searching for meaning, and instead found myself at the center of something so vast I could barely comprehend its edges. The being's light pulsed warmly, and I felt something like affection radiating from it, a tenderness that reminded me of how I imagined God might look upon his children, with infinite patience and understanding for our doubts and fears. You ask why you, it said, and its voice carried a smile I could feel rather than see, but you already know the answer in your heart, in the searching that brought you to this desert, in the prayers you have whispered to the stars your entire life, asking if there was more, if the universe held deeper truths than what your world had shown you. I felt tears burning in my eyes because it was true, because I had always felt like there was something beyond the veil of ordinary existence, something calling to me through every sunset and every moment of quiet wonder, through every unexplainable coincidence and every answered prayer that I'd been too afraid to fully acknowledge. Throughout history, it has never been kings or emperors who changed the course of humanity's understanding. The being continued, and the chamber around us seemed to brighten as if responding to its words, the glowing symbols pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. It has been fishermen and carpenters, shepherds and seekers, ordinary souls who carried extraordinary truth because their hearts were open enough to receive it, and their courage was strong enough to share it despite the cost. I thought of the disciples, of Mary Magdalene, of all the humble people through whom God had chosen to work his miracles, and I understood suddenly that this was the same pattern, the same divine design playing out on a cosmic scale. You were chosen because you have been searching, because your soul is awake enough to receive what we offer, because you understand that faith and science are not enemies, but two languages describing the same divine reality, the being said, and I felt the truth of it resonating through every cell of my body, confirming what I had always sensed but never dared to fully believe. You are one of many being awakened now, across your world, in every culture and nation. Ordinary people who will carry this message in their own ways, whose combined voices will create a chorus that cannot be ignored or silenced by those who profit from humanity's divisions. The being extended its hand toward me, and I watched as another vision formed, this time showing me glimpses of others like me, people standing in sacred sites and quiet rooms, on mountaintops and in city streets, each one receiving their own revelation, their own encounter with truth that shattered the boundaries between heaven and earth, between the physical and the spiritual, between what we had been taught was possible and what actually was. I saw their faces transformed by wonder, by the same overwhelming love that was filling my chest until I thought it might burst, and I understood that we were being woven together into a network of awakened souls, whose purpose was not to create a new religion or to tear down the old, but to remind humanity of what Jesus had taught, what every true prophet and Messiah had always known, that we are all one family, all children of the same Creator, all part of a cosmic tapestry so beautiful and intentional that even our science was only beginning to glimpse its magnificence. You will doubt yourself when you leave this place, the being said gently, and I appreciated its honesty, the acknowledgement that this experience would seem impossible in the light of ordinary day. You will wonder if this was real, if you imagined it, if you should speak or stay silent, but the crystal we will give you and the change in your heart will be your confirmation. And when you meet others who have been awakened, you will recognize each other by the light you carry, by the hope that refuses to die even when the world seems dark. I felt the being's presence wrap around me like an embrace, like the comfort I had always associated with prayer, with those moments of deep communion when I knew beyond doubt that God was real and present and infinitely loving. And I understood finally that this encounter was not separate from my faith but its fulfillment, that the same source who had sent Jesus to show us how to live was now sending these messengers to show us how vast his creation truly was. The truth you will carry is simple, the being said, and its voice resonated with the finality of a benediction, of a sacred charge being given, that love is the organizing principle of the universe, that consciousness is woven into the fabric of creation itself, that science and spirit are one, that humanity is ready to take its place in the cosmic family, and that the God you have worshipped in your limited understanding is so much greater and more wonderful than you have imagined, not diminished by this knowledge but magnified, not threatened by other worlds, but glorified by the infinite expressions of divine creativity that fill the cosmos. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders, not as a burden but as a calling, as the answer to every prayer I had ever offered, asking God to use me for something meaningful, to let my life matter in the grand design. The being's form seemed to expand then, filling the chamber with light so pure and radiant that I had to close my eyes. But even through my closed eyelids I could see it, a brilliance that penetrated not just my vision but my entire being, and when I opened them again the walls had dissolved into something else entirely, into a window or a portal that looked out onto a vision so breathtaking that I felt my knees weaken and my breath catch in my throat. Before you go, the being said, its voice now layered with harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, you must see what is possible, what waits for your world if humanity makes the choice to awaken, to remember who you truly are, and claim your birthright as conscious co-creators in this magnificent universe. The vision that unfolded before me was Earth, but not the Earth I had left behind when I entered this hidden chamber. This was Earth transformed, Earth as it was meant to be, Earth fulfilling the divine blueprint that had been planted in its soil and soul from the very beginning. I saw cities that grew like gardens, architecture that blended seamlessly with nature, buildings whose surfaces were alive with plants and light, technology so advanced it appeared as magic yet served only to enhance life rather than exploit it. And everywhere I looked there were people, humanity as I had never seen it, faces radiant with purpose and joy, no longer divided by the artificial boundaries of race or religion or nation, but united in the recognition of their shared divinity and cosmic citizenship. The vision zoomed closer and I could see details that made my heart soar. Children learning in schools where science and spirituality were taught as complementary truths, where they studied quantum physics alongside meditation, where they understood that prayer and intention could influence reality because consciousness itself was fundamental to creation, not some accident of evolution, but the very essence of what God had breathed into existence. I saw hospitals where healing involved not just medicine but energy work, where doctors acknowledged the soul as readily as they treated the body, where the placebo effect was understood, not as a trick of the mind, but as proof of our divine creative power, the same power Jesus had demonstrated when he healed the sick and raised the dead, not as violations of natural law but as applications of higher laws we had forgotten. I watched as the vision showed me vast gatherings, where humans stood alongside beings from other worlds, not in conquest or fear, but in fellowship, in the joyful recognition of kinship. And I realized I was witnessing the fulfillment of Jesus' prayer that earth would reflect heaven, that God's will would be done in the material realm as it was in the spiritual, that the kingdom he had spoken of was not just an afterlife destination, but a reality we were meant to build here, now, together. The beings I saw were diverse beyond imagination, some humanoid like my companion, others so different they barely fit my understanding of what life could be, yet all of them moved with grace and purpose, all of them radiating the same essential light. And I understood with sudden clarity that this was the many mansions Jesus had spoken of, not just rooms in heaven, but worlds upon worlds where God's children dwelled in infinite variety, all expressions of the same creative love, The scene shifted and I was shown humanity venturing outward, not as conquerors but as pilgrims, ships that moved through space using principles that married physics with consciousness, technology that responded to intention and operated in harmony with the living field that connected all things. And I saw humans working alongside their cosmic brothers and sisters to heal damaged worlds, to seed life where it had been extinguished, to serve as we had been created to serve, as stewards and gardeners of creation itself. I witnessed a moment that brought tears streaming down my face, a gathering of countless species around what I somehow knew was an ancient artifact of incredible power, and at the center stood humans, no longer the youngest or most primitive, but recognized as equals, contributing their unique gifts to the cosmic community. And the gift they offered was something I felt rather than saw. It was hope, it was resilience, it was the particular beauty of a species that had climbed up from darkness and chosen light, that had been given free will and learned through suffering to align it with love. "This is what Jesus came to show you," the being said softly, and I turned to look at it through my tears. "Not that humanity was fallen and worthless, but that you carried within you the same creative power as the Father, that you were made in the image of a God who is infinite consciousness, infinite love, infinite creative potential, and that your purpose was always to awaken to this truth and take your place in the great work of bringing heaven to earth and earth to heaven." I understood then that the second coming everyone had been waiting for was not one man descending from the clouds, but humanity itself rising to embody Christ consciousness. Billions of souls remembering their divine nature and choosing to live from that truth, choosing to see God in every face and every star, choosing to build the world I was witnessing with their own awakened hands and hearts. The vision began to fade and I reached out, involuntarily, desperate to hold on to it. But the being's hand touched mine, and I felt comfort flood through me, reassurance that what I had seen was not being taken away but planted inside me, as a seed, as a blueprint that would guide my steps and sustain my hope even through the difficult times ahead. "This future is not guaranteed," the being said, and there was urgency in its voice now, a reminder that free will meant the outcome was not predetermined, but it is possible. It is within reach, and every soul who awakens makes it more likely, tips the balance closer to manifestation, adds their light to the critical mass that will shift your entire species into this new way of being. I thought of the earth I had left outside this chamber, the earth of wars and environmental destruction, of materialism and spiritual emptiness, of people lost and afraid and convinced they were alone in an indifferent universe, and the contrast with what I had just witnessed was so stark it physically hurt, like a wound in my chest. But alongside the pain was something else, something powerful and unshakable. It was hope transformed into certainty. It was faith expanded beyond belief into direct knowing. It was the understanding that I had been given not just a vision but a responsibility, that I was being sent back not to escape the broken world but to help heal it, to be one of the voices calling humanity home to itself, to God, to the stars that had always been our destiny and our family. The being stepped back and the chamber began to dissolve around us, the glowing symbols fading like stars at dawn, and I felt the weight of my physical body returning as the visions released their hold on my consciousness, grounding me once more in flesh and bone and the cool stone beneath my feet. "It is time," the being said, and though its voice carried the same gentle authority it had held throughout the night, I heard in it now a note of farewell that made my heart clench with sudden loss, with the knowledge that this encounter was ending and I would have to return to a world that would seem smaller and darker after everything I had witnessed here. But even as that fear rose in me, the being reached out and placed something in my palm, closing my fingers around it with both of its luminous hands, and when I looked down I saw a crystal no larger than my thumb, perfectly geometric yet somehow organic, pulsing with an inner light that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. And I knew without being told that this was not merely a souvenir but a tool, a key, a living connection to everything I had experienced in this sacred space. "This will help you remember when doubt comes," the being said, "and doubt will come because you must walk back into a world that has forgotten these truths, where people will question your sanity and dismiss your experience, where the weight of ordinary life will press down on the extraordinary knowledge you now carry. But when you hold this and quiet your mind, you will feel the resonance. You will reconnect with this moment and with us, for we are never truly separate, only seemingly so." I closed my fist around the crystal and felt warmth spread through my hand and up my arm, a tingling vibration that seemed to align something deep within my cells, And when I looked up to thank the being, I found we were no longer in the hidden chamber, but standing at the base of the Great Pyramid, the first pink light of dawn just beginning to touch the ancient stones and turn the desert sand to gold. The being stood before me in that transforming light, and for the first time I could see it clearly, without the overwhelming radiance that had surrounded it inside. And what I saw was not so different from myself, a face that could have been human save for the eyes that held depths no human eyes had ever contained, wisdom and compassion and something else. A recognition that made me feel simultaneously humbled and elevated, seen in a way I had never been seen before. Why me? I asked again, the question that had echoed through the entire night returning with new urgency now that our time together was ending. Why was I chosen for this when I am nobody special, when I have no platform or power or credentials that would make people listen? The being smiled, and it was the most beautiful expression I had ever witnessed, warm and knowing and filled with an affection that pierced straight through every defense I had ever built around my heart. You were chosen precisely because you are what you call ordinary, it said, because throughout history it has always been the ordinary ones who carried extraordinary truth into the world and changed it. The fishermen who became apostles, the peasant girl who heard voices and led armies, the patent clerk who reimagined the universe, the seamstress who sparked a movement, and you who have spent your life searching and questioning and refusing to accept easy answers. You are ready now to be a vessel for this remembering, and you are not alone. There are thousands like you being awakened in this moment all over your world, each given pieces of the puzzle that humanity must solve together. I felt tears streaming down my face again, but they were different now, not tears of overwhelming awe but of acceptance, of understanding that my life had been leading to this moment, that every question I had asked and every answer I had rejected had been preparing me to receive this truth and carry it forward. And I nodded because words seemed inadequate to the moment, to the sacred covenant I felt forming between my soul and the mission I was being given. What do I tell them? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the dawn stillness. How do I explain what cannot be explained? How do I make them understand that God is so much bigger and more beautiful than we have imagined, that Jesus was showing us our own potential rather than his unique divinity, that we are not alone in a dead universe but part of a living cosmos, filled with our brothers and sisters? How do I say these things without being called a heretic or a lunatic? The being reached out and touched my forehead one last time, the same spot it had touched when showing me the vision of conscious cosmos. And I felt a download of knowing that was not words or images but something deeper, an intuitive understanding that would guide me in the days and years ahead, a compass that would point always toward truth even when the path was unclear. You tell them what you have seen and experienced, it said simply. You speak from your heart without trying to convince or convert. You share your truth and trust that those who are ready will hear it, will recognize it, will feel it resonate with something they have always known but forgotten. And you remember always that you are not responsible for awakening anyone. That is between each soul and the divine. Your only responsibility is to be faithful to what you have witnessed here, to let it transform how you live and love and see the world. For that transformation itself will be the most powerful testimony you can offer. I understood then that I was not being sent out as a prophet or a preacher, but simply as a witness, one voice among many singing the same ancient song in new words for a new age, calling humanity to remember what it had always been and step into what it was meant to become. And the weight of that felt both impossibly heavy and surprisingly light, a burden and a blessing woven so tightly together they could not be separated. The being began to fade as the sun crested the horizon, its form becoming transparent against the brightening sky, and I watched with my hand pressed against my chest where the crystal now rested in my shirt pocket, warm and pulsing like a second heart. And though I wanted to call out, to beg it to stay just a mom and longer, I knew this was how it had to be, that I had been given everything I needed, and now came the true test of walking this knowledge back into ordinary life and trusting it would sustain me. We will meet again. The being's voice came to me though I could no longer see it, the words arriving not through my ears but directly into my mind and heart. In this life or another, in this dimension or beyond it, for we are family, and family is forever, bound not by blood, but by the divine love that sources all creation. And whenever you look up at the stars, know that we are looking back, that we are cheering for humanity, believing in you even when you struggle to believe in yourselves, waiting for the day when you are ready to join us fully in the great dance of conscious co-creation that is God's eternal joy and purpose. Then it was gone, and I was alone at the pyramid's base with the crystal in my pocket, and the dawn breaking over the desert, and the absolute unshakable certainty that nothing would ever be the same, that I had been entrusted with a truth that was both ancient and urgent, that my life, from this moment forward, belonged not to myself alone, but to the awakening of my entire species. And though I did not know yet how I would fulfill this calling, I knew with every fiber of my being that I would spend the rest of my days trying, sharing this message of hope and divinity and cosmic family with anyone who would listen, planting seeds that might take years or lifetimes to grow but would eventually blossom into the beautiful future I had been shown. The earth transformed, humanity awakened, heaven and earth united at last as they were always meant to be. Have you ever felt like you were meant for something greater than what you've been told is possible? Subscribe to hear more stories that awaken the truth within.